Hello everyone and welcome to another Haes book nominee for the reading group over the summer. Today we are covering Fearing the Black Body, the Racial Origins of Fat Phobia. This book in particular is cited a lot in the fat acceptance, fat liberation sphere. Hotep Flotep actually made a really good point in one of his recent videos that it's referenced a lot, but it's never cited. Like, there's no page citation, there's no quotes pulled from it. When the discussion of, like, fat phobia being rooted in racism comes up, like, they'll reference the book saying, read Fearing the Black Body, but then they don't cite anything from it. They don't give any particular, like, quotes. They don't even cite chapters of, hey, in chapter 3 of Fearing the Black Body, we learned that whatever. Like, nothing is cited. So today we're going to read the introduction and see where it takes us. Actually starving. A prominent New York man dies in sight of food. Why could this be so? The dramatic, if slightly awkward, headline appeared in the February 16, 1894 edition of the New York Times, atop an article that began, "Thousands of men and women in New York are starving, although they have plenty of money to buy the best food." The unnamed author of the article went on to quote what was described as a prominent physician on the state of the American diet and physique. According to the doctor, the situation was dire. "I say that they are starving to death, slowly but surely," he stated, adding that although many of those afflicted were members of the middle and upper classes, they nevertheless looked emaciated and appeared to be consumptives. This article underscored the deep anxiety felt by many in the 19th century regarding the state of the American physique. Doctors in particular agonized over what they described as the pale, thin, and puny forms that were apparently proliferating around the country. Several described with horror that narrow chests and lank limbs and flabby muscles and tottering steps that meet us at every corner. Thinness, it seems, was nothing short of an epidemic. If in those years slenderness was considered a general American failing, the paleness, leanness, and malnutrition of women was particularly troubling. Prompted by the fragile state of their bodies, esteemed doctors wrote disquieting manifestos on the question of their frailty. The writings of the prolific and well-regarded New Englander Dr. William Alcott, a distant relative of the novelist Louisa May Alcott, were typical. In his 1855 treatise, The Young Woman's Book of Health, Alcott lamented the reality that our children, females among the rest, are trained by a community which is thus destitute of a true appetite. He warned Americans to take heed of what he described as the generation of women trained as a whole to tenderness, delicacy, nervousness, feebleness of muscle, and want of appetite. That was due partially, though, to I think they called it consumption, but we call it something else now, and it was it tuberculosis? I was right, it was tuberculosis. So tuberculosis was fairly rampant in the 19th century, and it actually shaped fashion a lot because it made people unnaturally pale and unnaturally thin, and it caused fainting spells, and that's why that was such a big thing. If you read 19th century literature, women having fainting spells was a thing, and part of this was because of tuberculosis. The concern over the health of the nation wasn't unwarranted, but to say that it was strictly from weight, it's not wrong, but it feels a little misleading in how it's written, because the big issue during this period that caused massive weight loss was actually tuberculosis. So, yeah, that's why, the feebleness, the want of appetite. Being tall, slender, and delicate, he claimed, did not prepare a young woman for the vicissitudes of life. Well, chances are, quite frankly, she wasn't going to live very long if she had tuberculosis. Dr. John Harvey Kellogg, the famed Seventh-day Adventist, already known for his sanitarium in Battle Creek, Michigan, but not yet known as a purveyor of breakfast cereals, concluded in his Lady's Guide to Health and Disease, particularly in this country, and especially in cities and towns, girls as a rule are found to be decidedly lacking in physical development. What the fair sex in America needed, Kellogg contended, was a nutritional revolution because their poor eating habits produced bodies that were scrawny and waspish. It was more than a simple question of health or even aesthetics. The slenderness of American girls was regarded as nothing less than a threat to the nation. Okay, so before we move on, can we acknowledge, though, that Kellogg pretty much thought cornflakes would fix everything? I mean, he put out cornflakes not as a nutritional thing, although maybe that was also another claim he had, but it was to stop masturbation. Like, he believed that if you give someone a really plain diet, they won't have any sexual urges. Like, that was, Kellogg was... There were many things about Kellogg that we could talk about. And he was a strange man even for his time, I think. I could be wrong about his time. But, yeah. The slenderness of American girls was regarded as nothing less than a threat to the nation. An 1888 article from the Washington Post that appeared under the headline, "Are Girls Growing Smaller?" exclaimed, "The girl of the period ranges from 140 pounds down in some cases to 80 pounds or less. In England and Germany, the figures are higher. 80 pounds of femininity is of course not much." And the writer added, "Our women will go on getting thinner and thinner until they disappear. It has happened in Boston already. The American stock can't hold its own against the big-boned, strong-built foreigner. The Irish have crowded the Yankee out of New England." The weight of American women represented to many a national black eye. But was it truly the case, as was often suggested, that these women were simply nutritionally uninformed? Given the right information, would they gain in flesh and by proxy in health, strength, and beauty? The evidence suggests otherwise. Many well-to-do women, it seems, were trying to be slender at a moment when doctors routinely attacked slenderness as unhealthy. The historian Adele Clark noted that women of the fashionable classes were wasting in style. This svelte style, being contrary to conventional medical wisdom, had clearly been motivated by other factors. Indeed, while many considered thinness an American shortcoming for the adherents of the styles, slenderness served as a marker of moral, racial, and national superiority. This attitude is on full display in the 1896 article from Harper's Bazaar titled, "Are Our Women Scrawny?" It begins with a reflection on the slenderness of American women. American women in general are still thought to be sallow and scrawny. The article's anonymous author contests this assertion, claiming that while poorer women may be malnourished, few women of the privileged classes are so slim as to look peaked, as may have been the case with their foremothers. Today, the author asserts American women have a wholesome glow in their cheek and a bit more flesh on their bones, both of which are a testament to the wholly unmeasured success of the American experiment. Yet while praising a new and laudable roundness to the figure of the modern girl, the author nevertheless betrays a preference for traditional American slenderness, one of shifting outlines of the nation's women, the author wrote, one cannot help noticing in every metropolitan assembly that the feminine litheness and flexibility for which the Republic has been famous is already on the wane, and that the opposite extreme is menacing. That fatness is described as menacing is telling. The author provides a sense of foreboding associated with the excess weight. Not only does stoutness supposedly sabotage the nation's aesthetic identity, it also evokes the poor eating habits and immorality of the European elite. Worse still, extreme or gross corpulence slides into the association with primitive Africans. The author spells this out for the reader. Stoutness, corpulence, and surplusage of flesh are never desirable except among African savages. This raises several questions. First, what led some well-to-do Americans to believe that slenderness, especially among women, was both aesthetically preferable and a sign of national identity? How did fatness become a sign of immorality? How did fatness become linked to Africanity or blackness? And finally, if the medical establishment just over a century ago feared the meagerness of the physiques of elite white women, and finally, if the medical establishment just over a century ago feared the meagerness of the physiques of elite white women, when and how did they come to view fatness, especially among black women, as the greater threat to public health, as they would in the late 20th and early 21st centuries with the obesity epidemic? In this book, I examine the history and legacy of the preference of slimness and aversion to fatness with attention to their racial, gender, class, and medical contours. This book enters a decades-long conversation about the preference for slenderness and the phobia around fatness in the United States. Much of this research describes the emphasis on slenderness for women, but while most authors show that an aversion to fatness and a preference for slenderness has been most evident among middle and upper-class white women, few have addressed the role of race and class status in the development of these dispositions. Relatedly, scholars have shown that the fear of fatness commonly targets low-income women of color, and especially black women. These and other scholars, including Sandra Gilman, Jennifer Morgan, and Janelle Hobson, have shown that black women's bodies have long been treated as being in excess. Still, few have attempted to explain how historically fatness became linked to blackness. Amy Farrell's 2011 book, Fat Shame, we just covered that, stands out in that it underscores the entwined racial past of fat stigma and the thin ideal. The book does not explore, however, how these racial connotations developed, nor does it explain the centrality of anti-blackness within them. We also learn about the role of morality in much of the existing literature. R. Mary Griffith's landmark 2004 text, Born Again Bodies, Flesh and Spirit in American Christianity, shines in this respect, offering a compelling deep dive into the admonitions against gluttony and fatness in Christianity. Well, okay, I actually kind of want to look at that now. That wasn't on my list of books, but I think if we cover this, I'm going to see if I can find this one, and then we'll read Fat Shame with it, since she's referencing these, and that way we can have this kind of amalgamation of these rhetorics commingling. And the thing about, gluttony in Christianity is that it's one of the 7 deadly sins. It's put on par with sloth, greed, lust, pride, wrath, and I think I'm forgetting one more. I can't remember the last one. Envy. So, anything that was seen as kind of self-destructive was labeled one of the 7 deadly sins, and those that didn't contribute to society. Notice that the 7 deadly sins kind of work in 2 parts. Those that are antisocial, gluttony being you're taking more than your fair share, envy meaning that you are clearly wanting to take away from your neighbor, pride in that you viewed yourself above others, wrath in which you lash out in anger. All of these both damage community ties and can be self-destructive. And I think that was part of the reason, be it conscious or not, of why those particular subjects were rated as like the 7 deadly sins. But so it's I think focusing just on gluttony in terms of Christian rhetoric is an uncharitable way of looking at that. And I'm not Christian. I've had plenty of Christians try to convert me because I was born into a pagan family. And I had a cauldron in my house for many years. We had plenty around, and the Christian families were not very happy with their children associating with me. So, but I know enough about it that I think this is an unfair look at gluttony in Christianity. I think gluttony has to be looked in the whole of the other 7 deadly sins in Christianity because they're all addressed. Nevertheless, though, it reveals that during the 19th century, the fit body was used to buttress claims of racial and ethnic superiority. Questions remained about how these relationships developed and were polarized within the American mainstream. This work departs from much of the existing scholarship in that it provides a historiography of the development of pro-thin, anti-fat biases. That is, while several studies have explored the historical antecedents of our contemporary size biases, none, to my knowledge, have endeavored a historical analysis that examines the key figures involved in their propagation, as well as the sociocultural and political factors contributing to their reinforcement. This book seeks to address the gap as possibly the first historical study of fat phobia and thin fetishism in the West, with an emphasis on the intertwined racial, gender, and moral issues involved in their advancement. I argue that 2 critical historical developments contributed to the fetish and svelteness and a phobia about fatness: the rise of the transatlantic slave trade and the spread of Protestantism. So, real quick about the spread of Protestantism. So, if you look at the pilgrims that were before the transatlantic slave trade, they came over here because they were too Protestant for England. Like, they did away with dancing, they didn't celebrate Christmas, they didn't do anything because, I think, nothing that would have them decorate or make anything prettier. Like, it was all about, it was like an extreme form of Protestantism. Pilgrims were like an extreme form of Protestant. So to say to the spread of Protestantism, if anything, maybe it was a resurgence, but that's about it. Like, the U.S. even now has some Protestant hang-ups, like our weirdness around sex. Racial scientific rhetoric about slavery-linked fatness to greedy Africans and religious discourse suggested that overeating was ungodly. Overeating being ungodly was well before this. I just want to be clear. We can fucking look at Dante's Inferno, for fuck's sake. And that's not even the oldest text around it, but like, greed and gluttony were one of the rings of hell in Dante's Inferno, and Dante's Inferno was written, I want to say 1500s? Don't quote me on that. Okay, I had to look it up. It was even earlier. Dante's Inferno was written in 1314. So that link between of religious discourse with overeating being ungodly has been around well before the U.S. was even considered a thing. I just want to put that out there. I think that there is a lot of over-focus on current times and not seeing that some of these thoughts and these ideas in around overeating being a negative thing date back centuries, way before the U.S. even existed. And so I think treating it as something more recent is misleading. These rationales for anti-fat bias have been circulating relatively independently in parts of Western Europe for more than 2 centuries. Oh, honey, it's been way, way more than 2 centuries. Not until the early 19th century in the United States, in the context of slavery, religious revivals, and the massive immigration of persons deemed part Africanoid, did these notions come together under the coherent ideology. In the United States, fatness was stigmatized as both black and sinful. Can you give us some examples of this? I mean, I know we saw that one article, but I'm wondering, like, one article in a sea of articles doesn't mean much. So, I mean, I'm hoping this is just the introduction, so perhaps throughout they give more examples of this, because I would be curious to see this. And by the early 20th century, slenderness was increasingly promoted in the popular media as the correct embodiment of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant women. Not until after these associations were already in place did the medical establishment begin its concerted effort to combat excess fat tissue as a major public health initiative. In this way, the fat phobia about fatness and the preference for thinness have not, principally or historically, been about health. Instead, they have been one way the body has been used to craft and legitimate race, sex, and class hierarchies. These findings further reveal that the slender ideal and fat phobia are not distinct developments, as they are often treated in literature. The fear of the imagined fat black woman was created by racial and religious ideologies that have been used to both degrade black women and discipline white women. This is critical since most analysis of race and aesthetics describe the experiences of either black people and other people of color or white people. This book reveals race to be a double agent. It entails the synchronized repression of savage blackness and the generation of disciplined whiteness. The discourse of fatness as coarse, immoral, and black worked to denigrate black women, and it concomitantly became the impetus for the promulgation of slender figures as the proper form of embodiment of elite white Christian women. For my analysis, I draw on the work of 2 eminent social theorists, Pierre Bourdieu and Michel Foucault. According to Bourdieu, elites are constantly working to differentiate themselves from the lower class. In doing so, they often distinguish themselves by cultivating tastes, diets, and physical appearances that are in opposition to those of the subordinate groups. These social distinctions serve to naturalize and normalize social hierarchies. Building on this work, I show how racial discourse was deployed by elite Europeans and white Americans to create social distinctions between themselves and so-called greedy and fat racial others. Black people, as well as so-called degraded or hybrid whites, Celtic Irish, Southern Italians, Russians, were primary targets for these arguments. Elite white people also used Protestant discourse to claim a moral superiority over these poor immigrant and racial others. I rely on the work of gender scholars to show that since women have long been evaluated based largely on their physical appearance, racial, moral, social distinctions primarily targeted the women in each racial ethnic group. If Bourdieu can help us understand the racial moral dimensions of the spread of fat aversion and thin preoccupation, Michel Foucault gives us insight into the centrality of medicine in the propagation of these dispositions. According to Foucault, medicine intervenes as a key institution of the 20th century, providing information on how to live for health and longevity. Its dictates inform what Foucault calls the biopolitics of health management, which include disciplinary practices that one must perform to be considered a healthy and thereby good citizen. However, the medical and disciplinary regime has not been objectively applied to all persons. Instead, it is treated as an imperative for dominant groups to the exclusion of the poor, racially othered groups. This approach helps to maintain social and, in many instances, specifically radicalized and gendered hierarchies. Researching the aesthetic, moral, and racial underpinnings of the American fear of fat required an eclectic approach. I began by reading the landmark text by historians and feminist scholars on the history of fat phobia and the slender ideal. In doing so, I discovered 3 points of agreement. First, there was a general consensus among historians and prominent feminist scholars that the fear of fat and glorification of thinness first gained widespread appeal in the United States. Second, these attitudes had more impact on elite and white women than on men, working-class persons, or people of color. Third, little is known about the factors contributing to the development of these attitudes. Interesting that you say little is known. Then, if little is known about the development of these attitudes, then this is a lot of guesswork on your part, isn't it? In an effort to discover what led to the consolidation of these attitudes around the turn of the 20th century, I used 2 comparative historical methods, process tracing and historical narrative. In process tracing, I used multiple sources of data to shed light on key individuals and events contributing to the growing anti-fat, pro-thin bias in the West. I used historical narrative to weave a tapestry illustrating the impacts and interrelationship of these events. I began with the Renaissance, a period in which, as sociologists and historians have shown, voluptuous physiques were in vogue throughout much of the Western world. I traced developments in art and philosophy from the Renaissance through the Enlightenment in Europe, the period in which scholars have shown svelte aristocratic women and courtiers were commonly depicted by renowned artists and thinkers. I studied the writings of artists and philosophers in an effort to describe the socio-historical and intellectual context for the association of race, weight, and beauty between the early 15th and late 18th centuries. So that's cool that she's using the Renaissance as a jumping off point, but the view of like excessive consumption being bad dates back to ancient Greece. So like this may have been an in vogue thing during the Renaissance and stuff, but I actually don't think she went back quite far enough. If the goal is weight, although for her it seems to be more of the intersection between weight and race, so perhaps this is a better starting point for her. Questions concerning the purported racial origins of fatness appear in many philosophical treatises, as did questions about its immorality. Therefore, I return to explorations of the body and the oral appetite in the ascendant branch of Christianity, Protestantism. I examine key texts by prominent Protestant proselytizers, especially those who made public pronouncements against overfeeding and fatness. To weave a historical narrative of these many related developments in art, philosophy, and religion, I needed to understand how they were being transmitted to the public. The 18th century marked the rise of newspapers and magazines in Europe, and so I examined influential early publications such as The Spectator to understand how ideas in high art and philosophy about body size, race, attractiveness, and morality were represented. Scholars have identified the U.S. as the country in which the pro-thin, anti-fat bias was gaining strength among elite, morally upright white Americans, especially women, by the 19th century, and crystallized into mainstream position by the early 20th century. Therefore, I also examined American magazines and newspapers published between 1830 and 1920, among them Cosmopolitan, originally a magazine designed to appeal to families, the New York Times, and the Washington Post, to look for evidence of these connections. Finally, I discovered that many of the popular periodicals cited concerns about health and illness purportedly associated with corpulence. By the late 19th century, these publications relied increasingly on doctors' advice to make their claims. Therefore, I researched the depictions of overweight and obesity in the medical literature from 1880 to 1930. I chose materials that appeared in authoritative books or medical journals such as the Journal of American Medical Association. or works written by recognized medical authorities. This book has 3 parts. Part 1, The Beauty of the Robust, offers a retrospective view of the exaltation of plump feminine physiques that existed throughout much of the Western history. I also note signs of this shift in the 17th century as European men of learning began to degrade fatness as evidence of insipidity. In chapter 1, Being Venus, I describe Western aesthetic ideals in the 16th century and show that key artists and philosophers during the High Renaissance described plump and proportionate women as beautiful, following Christian and neoclassical conventions of beauty. I argue that contact with African women during the rise of the slave trade did not change these standards. Moreover, I show that black women were incorporated into High Renaissance rhetoric and imagery of beauty as equally voluptuous, if socially inferior, counterparts to European women. In chapter 2, Plump Women and Thin, Fine Men, I describe the rise of robust, snow-white female bodies as desirable. I also show that the fat male body became a sign of poor moral character and mental capacity. That is, alongside the exaltation of fat and curvy white women, fat men were lambasted among intellectuals as being of poor constitution. English philosophers claimed that a fat male body was indicative of a dull mind, thus a philosopher's slim ideal was born. So, she makes a lot of interesting points here. I think, though, since she seems to be focusing primarily on the way that women were looked at and there was like a hard shift, I wonder if in the book she's also looking at the historical events surrounding that, because a lot happened between the Renaissance and between 1830 and 1920. A lot happened there historically, and I think it would be worth it to look up important events based on where she is in her timeline and see what else might have contributed to that if she doesn't reference it herself. Part 2, Race, Weight, God, and Country, describes how body size became a sign of race, morality, and national identity during the 18th and 19th centuries. In Chapter 3, The Rise of the Big Black Woman, I detail how philosophers and race scientists made the case for intellectual and physical differences between whites and the colored races. In this period, we see some of the earliest examples of learned men denigrating the so-called black fatness. In Chapter 4, Birth of the Ascetic Aesthetic, I focus on the developing relationship between Protestant Christian identity and self-abnegation. That wasn't that was a well-established identity. Protestant was around way before the 19th century, and self-abnegation was always like a core part of Protestantism. So that, I don't like the way that's worded. Perhaps I'm being nitpicky, but Protestants date back a long time. There was the whole Tudor family drama after Henry VIII, when it was between Mary and Elizabeth. Mary was Catholic, Elizabeth was Protestant, and there was, during the transubstantiation portion of Mass, Elizabeth I walked out of the church because she's like, I don't believe in this shit. And then there was fucking Mary, who went Catholic nuts and was just burning Protestants at the stake. And Protestants, when Protestants came into power, they went and ransacked Catholic churches, burning the murals because they believed that churches should not have that much decoration to them. And then I think eventually Elizabeth established a be and let be sort of situation, but I don't remember for sure. I'd have to look it up. But this wasn't a developing relationship between Protestant Christianity identity and self-abnegation. That was already established. I just want to make that clear. I showed that abstemiousness in England during the 18th century laid the groundwork for moralizing surrounding the oral appetites that would be seen in subsequent eras, particularly in the United States. I also show that some devout Protestants viewed fatness, the purported evidence of intemperate eating, as immoral. Of course they did. They're Protestant. They're fucking... Do you know what Protestants are? Protestants think that you're immoral if you dance. Protestants think you're immoral if you flavor your food, for fuck's sake. I mean, when you take it to the extreme. When you take it to the extreme, which fucking... There, not too long ago, it was. I mean, they're Protestant. Slenderness, by contrast, was viewed as closer to godliness. Yes, because you were withholding from yourself. Because they're Protestant. In Chapter 5, American Beauty, The Reign of the Slender Aesthetic, I show that American Anglo-Saxon women adopted the ideals surrounding eating and embodiment that were popularized in the 18th century England. In the context of religious health reform movements and massive immigration of Irish racial others, Anglo-Saxon women used strict diets and slimness to convey religious enlightenment and racial uplift. In Chapter 6, Thinness as American Exceptionalism, I reveal how the presence of these new wave immigrants, Southern and Eastern Europeans, contributed to the mainstream consolidation of the aesthetic of slimness. Following the trail of race science, I show that the new eugenic discourse of racial amalgamation among Northern and Western Europeans circulated widely in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This rhetoric promoted the desirability of women from these racial groups. It also intimated that the American melting pot created exceptional svelte beauties drawn from these superior races. Part 3, Doctors Weigh In, examines how the American medical establishment viewed fatness and thinness from the late 19th up to the late 20th centuries. In Chapter 7, Good Health to Uplift the Race, I profile the life and works of the esteemed Dr. John Harvey Kellogg. I show that he, like many medical men of his day, regarded poor diet and excessive slimness, especially among elite American women, as a threat to the nation. Kellogg and others hope to encourage women to gain weight to demonstrate the vigor of the nation. In Chapter 8, Fat Revisited, I explain the growth of the anti-fat attitudes in the medical field due to the rise of actuarial tables that identified excessive weight as a health risk. Doctors became increasingly concerned about overweight. While the transition was slow at first, the standardization of normal weight and an intensified concern about obesity, especially among women, were firmly established within the mainstream of medical science by the turn of the 21st century. In the book's epilogue, The Obesity Epidemic, I highlight the swing from one epidemic, that of being too thin American women, to the other, that of being too fat American women, in the span of a century, and I underscore the role that race, aesthetics, morality, and medicine continue to play in the so-called obesity epidemic. So it seems like there's one, she seems to like, granted, I still need to read like the full chapter, so perhaps I'm completely not getting it, but it almost seems like she lauds Kellogg, and Kellogg had plenty of issues. So I think this one will require a little bit of research should we go through it, but this seems fairly interesting to go through, only because there's some things here that I feel like that are slanted, I guess is the best way to put it. They feel slanted. I think starting off in the Renaissance actually isn't great, because this whole anti-fat thing that she's been going for has been around since ancient Greece. So let's start with that. And even if you want to go into more recent history, Dante's Inferno had an entire ring of hell devoted to gluttony, which was started before the time that she starts her book. So that, plus her views on Protestants of how self-abnegation is somehow a new thing for Protestants, and it's not. And then this whole thing with Kellogg, we'll do a fucking full biography on Kellogg. How about that? So, like, there's a lot to unpack here. and we'll take it one chapter at a time if we do go this route. I'm thinking that if we do go this route, I might group it with some of the books that she references, like Fat Shame, which I wasn't a huge fan of, but if I did it in conjunction with this, it might actually be interesting. And then we can look up... I need to find the other book that she referenced, because it wasn't one in my... Oh, here we are. It was Born, again, Bodies, Flesh, and Spirit in American Christianity. This one I kind of want to see as well, and so we would do it all together. So let me know what you think of this book. I think it would be really interesting to go over, and I will see you in the next video.